Hello everyone, and welcome back to MrDarXnights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. He died with his eyes open, and his heartbeat still echoing faintly in the silence of his bedroom. There were no bruises, no blood, no broken bones, just a 12-year-old boy, lying in bed, mouth frozen in a silent scream, as if he saw something no one else could. His name was Caleb Brooks. And what happened to him that cold October night in 1996 has haunted the forgotten town of Black Hollow for nearly 30 years. The official report said, natural causes. But I've read the autopsy. I've seen the photos. Caleb didn't die peacefully. He died trapped in a nightmare, one that left no trace, no killer, no evidence, just a cassette tape playing white noise and a journal filled with sketches of a man with no eyes. I used to work cases like these. I was an FBI profiler for 22 years. I thought I'd seen it all. But this? This wasn't a crime. It was a warning. Because now, decades later, children across 3 states have started dying the same way. And last week, I found Caleb's tape in my own mailbox. My name is Ethan Graves. I have 72 days left to live. Before cancer takes me. And before it does? I need to know what killed that boy. They found Caleb Brooks on a cold October morning, just before dawn, lying perfectly still in his bed. His body hadn't moved an inch since the night before. The sheets were tucked neatly around him, his hands resting calmly on his chest, as if placed there with purpose. But there was something deeply wrong with the way he looked. His eyes were wide open, dry and glassy, staring directly at the ceiling. His mouth was slightly open, frozen in what looked like the early stages of a scream that never fully formed. His skin had already taken on the faint pale blue hue of death. There was no sign of a struggle. No bruises, no blood, no wounds of any kind. And yet, everything in the room felt violated, like something had passed through it that didn't belong. The alarm clock on the nightstand was blinking. 3:17 a.m. It wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't out of batteries. It had simply stopped, frozen in that moment, as if time itself had taken a breath and refused to exhale. Next to it lay Caleb's old Walkman, its headphones still resting on his ears. The cassette inside was still spinning slowly, playing a hiss of white noise so faint it was almost inaudible. But if someone had leaned in closely enough, they might have heard something underneath the static. Something like a whisper. A murmur. But no one did. The coroner would later write that the cause of death was unknown. The body bore no signs of trauma. Toxicology came back clean. His heart had stopped sometime in the early hours of the morning, and that was that. But a few details didn't make it into the report. Like the fingernail scratches found just beneath his eyelids, too deep to be superficial, as if he had tried desperately to claw them shut. Or the small tear in his right pupil, a rupture usually only seen in cases of extreme fear. Or the fact that his facial muscles had frozen mid-expression in a way the medical examiner had never seen before, caught somewhere between a scream and a stare. It wasn't just the body that made the authorities uneasy. The bedroom itself had an unnatural stillness to it. Not just the quiet that follows a death, but something more oppressive. The kind of silence that presses against the walls and seems to hum beneath the floorboards. Caleb's room had always been cluttered with books and drawings. He liked to sketch, mostly monsters and imaginary places. But the pictures found on his desk that morning didn't feel like imagination. They were crude, sure, drawn by a child's hand, but disturbingly detailed. Figure after figure, always the same, a tall, thin man with no eyes, no mouth, and skin like smudged ash. Standing beside Caleb's bed. Sometimes in the doorway. Sometimes crouched just above him. One drawing showed the figure holding something to Caleb's ear, a rectangle, with a wire. A tape player. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone in that little West Virginia town felt it. This wasn't just a child who passed in his sleep. It was something else. Something that had slipped through the cracks of the world and left no fingerprints behind. The sheriff, a quiet man who'd seen his fair share of strange deaths in the region, filed it away as natural causes pending investigation. But even he stopped sleeping right after. Not because of guilt. But because of the way Caleb's eyes seemed to follow him, even in photographs. Wide open. Unblinking. Caleb's parents moved away not long after. Left the house completely furnished, as if they couldn't bear to touch a thing. The room was sealed off, curtains drawn, doors shut tight with duct tape. No one in town dared to go back in. Local kids dared each other to touch the mailbox, or walk up to the porch steps at night, but no one ever crossed the threshold. There were whispers, of course. They called it cursed. Haunted. Some said it was just a tragic story, nothing more. But a few remembered something older. A bedtime story turned cautionary tale about a voice in the night that could slip into dreams and freeze your soul before you ever had a chance to scream. They called it The Murmur. But stories like that always surface after tragedy. People like to give fear a name. It's easier that way. The official file sat untouched in a dusty cabinet for years. Caleb Brooks, age 12. Deceased. No known cause. No sign of foul play. No leads. No suspects. Just one line scrawled in pen across the bottom corner of the folder, written by the coroner himself in a moment of quiet frustration before he closed the file forever. It looked like he died, trying not to fall asleep. The body of Caleb Brooks arrived at the county coroner's office just after noon, wrapped in a white sheet and accompanied by a silence that clung to the walls of the exam room. It was a small facility, like most things in rural West Virginia, underfunded, understaffed, and not equipped to handle mysteries. But mysteries don't ask for permission before they arrive. They just appear, cold and patient, waiting to be opened like a wound. The initial examination offered nothing. No bruising. No abrasions. No ligature marks. His skin was clean, unbroken. The coroner, a middle-aged man named Dr. Harold Mears, had handled nearly every unusual case in the county for 2 decades. Car wrecks, hunting accidents, even the occasional overdose from the rougher side of town. But he had never seen a 12-year-old boy arrive without a single visible cause of death. There was no trauma to the head or chest. The lungs were pink, the heart was unscarred, and the brain showed no sign of swelling or hemorrhage. Every system, at a glance, appeared intact. But Caleb was dead. The toxicology report came back within 48 hours. No signs of narcotics. No alcohol. No evidence of environmental toxins or allergens. Not a single foreign chemical in his bloodstream. He hadn't choked, hadn't suffocated, hadn't been poisoned. His heart had simply stopped beating in the middle of the night, without reason, without cause, as if the body had simply chosen not to continue. Dr. Mears wasn't satisfied with the basics. Something about the boy's expression disturbed him. He had seen corpses with eyes open before. It wasn't rare. But there was something unnatural in Caleb's stare, something not quite vacant, not quite peaceful. It was locked. Tense. As though his final moments were frozen in a snapshot of fear so profound, even death couldn't erase it. When the skin was examined more closely, the coroner found faint marks beneath each eyelid, scratches, superficial but deliberate. The kind that could only be made with fingernails. Tiny crescent-shaped impressions told a story the reports wouldn't. Caleb had been trying to close his own eyes. Whether from pain, terror, or something else entirely, he had scratched at his own face in the moments before death. It wasn't violent. It wasn't frenzied. It was quiet, restrained. But desperate. The inside of the mouth told more. The muscles in the jaw had seized, clamping down in a half-scream that had never escaped. His vocal cords were raw, but not from use. From tension. The kind of physical strain that comes from trying to yell while something inside you refuses to let you. A paralyzed fear, locked so deeply into the nervous system that the body went rigid before the breath could leave the lungs. His pupils were both fully dilated, suggesting a moment of intense darkness or sudden fear. But the truly strange part lay in the right eye. Upon inspection, a small rupture had formed along the edge of the iris, something called a sphincter tear. These injuries are rare in children and typically seen in cases of sudden blunt trauma or emotional shock so overwhelming it causes a spike in ocular pressure. There had been no trauma. No accident. Yet the eye was damaged, as if it had seen something it wasn't meant to, and the act of witnessing alone had torn it open. The boy's heart showed signs of elevated cortisol levels, enough to indicate an adrenaline spike shortly before death. Not just fear, pure terror. As if his final waking moment had been one of fight-or-flight response, but his body had chosen neither. It had simply given up. Shut down. Quit. Then there was the matter of the headphones. Caleb had been wearing a standard-issue cassette Walkman. Inside was a cassette labeled simply, sleep tape. It contained a 45-minute track of low-volume static, white noise, presumably something he used to help himself fall asleep. The tape had no manufacturer's label, and the handwriting was unfamiliar to the family. They said Caleb had never needed white noise before, and no one could recall where he'd gotten the tape. The tape itself was analyzed briefly by a technician, more out of curiosity than forensic need. Nothing of note was initially detected. But when played at half speed, faint irregularities emerged beneath the static, non-rhythmic pulses, like whispered consonants buried deep under the surface. The audio file was sent to a lab in Ohio for spectral analysis, but the request was never processed. The facility burned down in a freak electrical fire 3 days after receiving the package. The original tape was destroyed in the blaze. Only a digital copy remained, locked in a corrupted folder that refused to open without crashing every system it touched. Eventually, the coroner signed off on the case. He listed the cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest due to undiagnosed congenital defect, even though no such defect had been found. It was easier that way. Easier to move on. Easier to close the file. But Dr. Mears never forgot. Not because of the body. Not because of the tape. But because of a single phrase he had written in his private notebook, one he never shared with law enforcement, not even with his wife. A sentence that came to him in the middle of the night, scrawled in his own shaky handwriting, though he didn't remember writing it. He died while dreaming someone else's nightmare. After the funeral, Caleb's belongings were boxed up by distant relatives and left in the attic of a cousin's farmhouse 2 towns over. Most of his things were routine: schoolbooks, comics, pencils worn down to the metal, and old sketches folded into jagged stacks. But at the bottom of one cardboard box, underneath a layer of crumpled clothes, there was a small, unmarked notebook bound in black leather. The edges were frayed, and the pages inside carried the faint scent of mold and graphite. It didn't look like something Caleb would have bought, or something a child would have chosen to use. It had weight, not just physical, but emotional. The kind of weight that feels like a warning. The handwriting inside was unmistakably his. Slanted letters, the occasional backward S, doodles in the margins, tiny attempts to make monsters look less frightening. It began like any child's diary, brief entries, dates with no real context, random thoughts about the day, the weather, or school. But the tone shifted quickly. The cheerful ink turned to heavier scribbles. The entries grew shorter, more erratic. And then, halfway through the journal, Caleb stopped writing about his life entirely. He began writing about his dreams. He described the first dream as a place without sky. A hallway with no doors, only shadows stretching endlessly in both directions. He wrote about a sound, something like breathing, but wrong, like air being pulled in through water. He said it watched him, but it didn't have eyes. Just a shape, tall and still, always standing far away. No face. No name. Just presence. The next night, the hallway returned, but now there was a sound at the end, a slow scraping, like something dragging its body across the walls. Caleb wrote that he tried to scream, but nothing came out. That his own breath was too loud, too heavy, and every time he exhaled, the thing moved closer. He called it the listener. He began sleeping with the lights on. One entry mentioned that he left his cassette player on all night to drown out the silence. The white noise helped, he said, but only at first. After the 3rd night, he began hearing things under the static. A whisper, low and slow, repeating the same syllable over and over again. He never wrote what the syllable was, only that it made his ears ring and his nose bleed the next morning. The dreams didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. The listener started appearing in corners of his room, never moving, never blinking, but always there. Caleb wrote that it wasn't just a dream anymore. That it followed him into the day, into mirrors, into the spaces between thoughts when his mind wandered too far. He wrote that he could feel it watching him from inside his own skull. The handwriting grew more chaotic as the entries continued. Words ran off the lines. Sentences were crossed out and rewritten multiple times. Sometimes he scratched entire pages black with pencil, as if trying to bury what was written underneath. One page had the phrase, "Don't listen to it," scrawled over a dozen times in increasingly frantic letters. On another, the ink bled through from heavy pressure, each word etched into the paper like a wound. "It's learning to sound like me." In the final entries, Caleb began to suspect that the cassette tape wasn't helping him sleep. He believed it was opening something. Tuning his brain like a signal, making him easier to find. He mentioned headaches, visions during the day, and moments where he would lose time, wake up on the floor or find drawings he didn't remember making. He wrote that the listener wasn't just a dream figure anymore, but an idea, a parasite that nested inside your thoughts, your hearing, your memory. One chilling line stood alone at the bottom of a nearly blank page. "It speaks in my voice now." The last entry was dated 2 days before his death. The handwriting was nearly illegible, a feverish scrawl that filled the page with overlapping phrases, some written backward, some upside down. Between the chaos, one sentence had been underlined 3 times. It said, "I'm next unless I give it someone else." After that, the journal stopped. It was never included in the police report. No one officially documented it. The cousin who found the notebook read only a few pages before throwing it into the fireplace, claiming it gave him a migraine that wouldn't go away until the cover was ash. But not before he photocopied a few of the final pages. He said he needed proof, in case the dreams ever came for him too. Years later, those copies surfaced online. Blurry scans posted to an obscure forum discussing unexplained deaths. The photos were dismissed as an ARG, another creepy internet hoax. But among the hundreds of replies was a single comment that stood out. It had no username, no profile photo, and was posted at exactly 3:17 a.m. It simply read, "He was right. It does sound like me now." The sleep study took place 6 months before Caleb's death, though its significance wouldn't be understood until years later. At the time, it was dismissed as an unusual but inconclusive case, a child referred for chronic insomnia and parasomnia, evaluated for night terrors and suspected mild epilepsy. The lab was part of a clinical research program at a small hospital in Ohio, rarely funded and even more rarely staffed by professionals equipped to handle anything outside the realm of textbook disorders. What happened during that single night's observation would never make it into a peer-reviewed journal or even be submitted for academic review. Most of the original files were quietly sealed. Some were deleted. Others went missing entirely. Caleb was hooked up to a standard polysomnography setup. Electrodes along the scalp, sensors on his chest, a small oxygen monitor taped under his nose. His vital signs were monitored, brainwave activity recorded, and the entire session captured by a single black and white infrared camera mounted in the top corner of the room. Nothing about the first 2 hours was unusual. He fell asleep quickly for someone supposedly plagued by insomnia, and the early stages of sleep were normal, stage 1 to stage 2, minimal movement, consistent heart rate. But as he entered REM sleep, the equipment began picking up anomalies. First, the EEG spiked irregularly. Sharp bursts of activity inconsistent with dreams or even seizures. Patterns that pulsed like signals, rhythmic and repeated, almost like code. Then came the sound. The microphone in the sleep lab wasn't meant to capture high-fidelity audio, just enough to record ambient noise, breathing, and occasional sleep talking. But at 3:17 a.m., a deep, wet clicking noise emerged from the left speaker. It wasn't Caleb. His mouth was closed, his breathing unchanged. The sound did not originate from his body. It echoed faintly, as if coming from beneath the bed or just behind the wall. Technicians noted the timestamp, adjusted the sensitivity, and moved on. But minutes later, the camera footage showed something they couldn't explain. Caleb remained motionless, but the shadows in the room did not. They shifted independently of the light source, as if responding to something unseen. One elongated smear began to stretch from the far corner of the room toward the bed. Frame by frame, the distortion crept along the floor, not fast, not obvious, but unmistakable when reviewed later. Then the biometric data glitched. The heart rate monitor jumped to 0 for a full 6 seconds. Respiratory data flatlined. Yet Caleb never stopped breathing. His chest moved. His body remained still. The machine simply refused to register any life. After those 6 seconds, the numbers returned to normal as if nothing had happened. Later that hour, the camera briefly lost focus. Only for a second. But when it came back, Caleb's eyes were open. Wide, unfocused, pupils dilated far beyond normal. His face didn't move, but both eyes stared directly into the camera. It wasn't REM sleep. He wasn't dreaming. But he wasn't awake either. One technician swore he saw the boy mouthing something, silent, deliberate movements of the lips. When enhanced and slowed down, the footage seemed to match 4 syllables. Let it out. Now. At precisely 3:33 a.m., all the equipment failed at once. The screen went black. The audio went silent. No feed, no readings, just static. When power returned 42 seconds later, Caleb was still in bed, eyes closed again, no sign of distress. But when the technicians reviewed the real-time backup recording, meant to run independently from the lab's power supply, they found something else entirely. The footage during the blackout was overwritten with an image, a single frame, repeated over and over, burned into the video stream. It was not a camera glitch. The file header had been altered. Some lines of code were in characters the operating system couldn't interpret, showing only black diamonds and question marks. But the frame that had replaced the missing footage was clear, an image of the room, identical in angle to the lab camera's view, except for one change. In the image, there was a second figure standing at the foot of Caleb's bed. It had no visible features, no outline of a face, just a tall, dark distortion stretching upward into the camera's blind spot. There were no feet. No hands. Its arms hung in a way that bent slightly against gravity, as if the elbows reversed inward. And though it didn't move, it gave the unmistakable impression of watching, leaning in closer to something fragile, curious and patient. It was later described by one of the researchers as an optical silence. When hospital staff attempted to retrieve the footage, the backup drive failed. 3 separate attempts to recover it caused other connected systems to crash. A week later, the senior technician who handled the footage suffered a breakdown and refused to speak of the incident again. His resignation letter was short, almost cryptic. There's something living in the sleep between seconds. The sleep study was never mentioned in Caleb's autopsy or the coroner's report. All that remained were a few corrupted video files, scattered whispers from hospital staff, and a name scribbled in the margins of a torn intake form, written in handwriting no one could identify. The listener is learning. The name didn't come from Caleb. It came from another child. One no one had connected to the case before because, officially, he was never involved. His name was Thomas Elroy, a 7-year-old boy born profoundly deaf, with no prior link to Caleb or his family. But when a substitute teacher at his special education school asked the class to draw their dreams as part of an afternoon activity, Thomas drew something that would stop the entire classroom cold. His paper showed a child's version of a bedroom. Simple lines, stick figure drawings. In the bed, a small figure with closed eyes. At the foot of the bed, a long, black shape standing upright, its arms thin and curved downward. The walls of the room were lined with words, rows and rows of repeated shapes that, when translated from Thomas's invented symbolic language, all said the same thing. He listens through the silence. When asked what the drawing meant, Thomas tapped repeatedly on the paper, then signed a single phrase in American Sign Language. The listener came to Caleb first. The staff initially assumed he had overheard something, maybe from a TV or passing adult. But Thomas couldn't hear. His cochlear implants had failed weeks before, and no one had mentioned Caleb's name in his presence. When his mother asked how he knew the boy, Thomas responded with a blank stare, followed by a burst of rapid, frantic signing. She recorded it and brought it to a retired ASL interpreter. The translation wasn't perfect, some signs were strange, exaggerated, but the message was consistent. Caleb's room has no end. There are no corners. It grows while you sleep. He's still inside. The listener feeds on being remembered. At first, it sounded like a child's fantasy, the kind born of nightmares and overheard horror stories. But what Thomas said next made it impossible to dismiss. He described the exact layout of Caleb's bedroom, including specific objects that weren't part of any public news report, the torn corner of a Spider-Man poster, the broken drawer knob shaped like a baseball, the way the nightlight blinked twice before staying on. The level of detail was unnerving. When asked how he knew, Thomas answered only with silence, followed by a finger drawn across his lips, and then 2 taps to his ear. After that day, his behavior began to shift. He became withdrawn, refusing to sleep in his own room. He stopped eating normally. His drawings changed, becoming increasingly abstract and disturbing. At night, he would sign to empty spaces in the corners of rooms, as though someone were standing there, listening without responding. His mother installed a baby monitor in his bedroom to keep watch, though he was far past the age for one. Most nights, there was nothing unusual. But once, just after 3 a.m., she caught Thomas standing upright in the middle of the room, eyes closed, hands moving in perfect, synchronized rhythm, signing a phrase over and over again. Let him out. The video went viral on a small forum dedicated to sleep disorders and anomalous childhood behavior. It would have faded into internet obscurity had a retired sleep technician not commented on the post under an anonymous account. The comment was brief but alarming. We had another boy who signed the same phrase in his sleep. That boy's name was Caleb. Within days, the video was taken down. The forum thread was locked. The user who posted it deleted their account. But others had seen it, and the story spread like an urban legend, twisted and reshaped by fear. Some claimed Thomas was a medium. Others insisted he and Caleb had shared some kind of experimental sleep study gone wrong. A few believed the listener was a form of tulpa, a consciousness birthed from fear and attention, growing stronger with every retelling. What made it worse was that Thomas eventually stopped signing entirely. He became mute by choice, refusing all communication, even with his hands. Doctors diagnosed it as selective mutism, brought on by trauma. But trauma from what? He had no known connection to Caleb's family, had never visited their home, and had no history of psychological disturbance prior to the drawing. His mother insisted on moving after she began to hear faint knocks in the hallway at night, always at 3:17 a.m., always 3 knocks, always followed by silence so thick it felt alive. Before they left town, Thomas handed her one final drawing. No house this time. No bed. Just a circle, perfectly dark and wide, drawn with such force the paper tore slightly in the center. Around it, a phrase repeated over and over again in jagged black crayon. He listens better in the dark. To this day, Thomas has never spoken again. The whispers began when the story reached the wrong kind of people. Urban legend channels. Cursed forums. Late-night Reddit threads that claimed to document true accounts of forgotten rituals. The more people talked about Caleb and the listener, the more patterns emerged. One particular thread, posted anonymously under a screen name traced to a now-defunct academic server, spoke of an old psychological experiment involving mirrors. Not a published study, but a quiet, whispered procedure passed between fringe researchers studying dissociation, hallucinations, and sleep disorders. The concept was simple, but unsettling. Sit in a dark room. Place a mirror directly in front of you. Illuminate your face with a single candle or low-watt light behind you, dim enough to barely reflect your features. Stare at your own eyes for exactly 10 minutes. Do not blink too much. Do not speak. Do not move. Do not break eye contact. And never, under any circumstance, acknowledge any changes in the reflection. What was once considered an obscure psychological test now carried a name in online circles: the listener's gaze. Those who attempted it described a range of experiences. At first, it was mundane, shadows shifting, the human brain misfiring in low light, tricking itself into seeing warping facial features. But past the 5-minute mark, things grew worse. Observers reported feeling watched from behind their own reflection, a sensation like breath on the back of their neck, even in sealed rooms. Some claimed their reflections began moving out of sync. Others said the reflection started to smile independently, or blinked on a delay, always slightly behind. One chilling account came from a teenager in Iowa who uploaded his experience live, promising his followers a challenge stream. At 7 minutes in, he stopped speaking. At 8, his pupils widened unnaturally, and he leaned closer to the mirror, mouth slightly open, as though listening. At 10 minutes, he whispered something inaudible to the glass, then shut off the stream abruptly. The next day, his mother found him still sitting in front of the mirror, his eyes wide open, mouth slack, completely unresponsive. No physical trauma. No signs of damage. Just a complete psychological shutdown. He never spoke again. The only word he had written down before the incident, found scrawled on a sticky note beside his desk, was, "He's in the mirror now." Experts tried to dismiss the ritual as a meme-based placebo, a psychological trick fueled by expectation and fear. But it kept happening. Quietly, without fanfare, without patterns. Different ages. Different states. All reported the same outcome, some kind of trance, usually ending with a silence that never truly left the person again. A private investigator in Colorado, researching missing persons, found the ritual mentioned in the personal notebook of one of the victims, a boy named Emmett who vanished in his own home. The notebook was filled with increasingly cryptic entries, some of them nonsensical at first glance. "I see the version of me that doesn't blink." Or, "He copies me slower now. I'm not the original anymore." The final entry, written in large, messy letters. "If he answers when you ask his name, it's already too late." The investigator, skeptical but curious, attempted the ritual herself with her recorder running. 10 minutes later, she left the room and vomited in her kitchen sink. When asked what she saw, she simply said, "I blinked, and he didn't." She resigned 3 days later. Her case notes were sealed. No further action was taken. Somewhere along the timeline, the ritual began mutating. Not in process, but in consequence. People began reporting that once you attempted it, mirrors behaved differently afterward. Reflections appearing in rooms you weren't in. Double images. Movements just out of sync. Most chilling were the reports from those who covered or removed every mirror in their homes, yet still claimed to catch glimpses of themselves in windows, puddles, or even polished silverware. The reflection always staring, always slightly delayed, always smiling faintly. The connection to Caleb became harder to ignore. An autopsy photo, never released to the public but leaked through a corrupted .zip file shared on a deep web archive, allegedly showed the boy's eyes held open with surgical precision. A mirror shard was placed gently in his palm. The metadata on the file had been corrupted, overwritten with a repeated phrase written in binary: "He watched himself vanish." Researchers who attempted to trace the file source discovered it came from an anonymous university IP, rerouted dozens of times. The upload time was exactly 3:17 a.m. The file has since vanished from the web entirely, leaving behind nothing but partial screenshots and speculation. Still, people continue to try the ritual, drawn in by curiosity, dread, or disbelief. Some see nothing. Some see too much. And some never speak again. The legend endures. Because deep down, everyone wants to know the truth about themselves. What lies behind their own eyes. And some are willing to risk everything to find out. Even if what stares back isn't really them anymore. The digital trail never quite vanished, even as the mainstream buried the story. Threads deleted. Accounts deactivated. Video clips removed mid-upload. Yet fragments remained, on hard drives, obscure forums, corrupted cloud backups. A pattern emerged for those who looked closely enough. Most of the affected subjects had received anonymous emails prior to their descent, each containing a single sentence with no subject line, no signature, and no metadata to trace its source. The sentence varied slightly between victims, but the structure remained. "You've already seen him, haven't you?" Or, "He's seen you now." Or, in the most disturbing case, the reflection moved first. Those who received the message would often go silent online. Social media posts ceased. Phone calls stopped. GPS logs showed them at home, awake, active, yet none answered their doors, and surveillance footage from doorbells or building security showed no one coming or going. They simply stayed still, as if listening for something. Reports from family members painted a consistent picture. The affected became obsessed with symmetry. Perfect lines. Mirrored images. Some rearranged their rooms to be more geometrically balanced. Some started speaking in mirrored sentences, repeating phrases forward and backward as if rehearsing them in reverse. One man in New Hampshire was found scribbling palindromes across his living room walls, covering every surface until there was no white space left. When police arrived, they found him lying face down in front of a shattered bathroom mirror. His final recorded message, left in a voice memo at 3:17 a.m., was simply, "He only copies what I fear." Medical professionals attempted to categorize it as mass hysteria or psychological contagion, ideas spreading through vulnerable minds via suggestion and fear. But that failed to explain the physical anomalies. In over half the cases, mirrors cracked without impact. Surveillance footage reversed for no reason. Digital photographs developed mirrored, even when untouched. Metadata altered by forces beyond the software's understanding. The files stored in phones and cloud servers bore strange watermarks invisible to the naked eye, only visible when decrypted through custom image layer software. A circle. A jagged line. 2 dots. All arranged to resemble a face, twisted and incomplete. Experts called it digital corruption. Conspiracy theorists called it a symbol. They dubbed it the Watcher's Mark. Not everyone believed in the supernatural theory. A small collective of online researchers and cyber archivists tried to trace the myth back to its origin. They unearthed a case from 1998, buried in archived police records from rural Montana. A family of 5 found dead in their farmhouse, no signs of struggle, all seated in front of reflective surfaces, television screens, window panes, polished brass plates. The coroner's notes described each face as locked in a faint expression of recognition. The only anomaly in the room was an antique mirror nailed face down to the wall in the parents' bedroom, with a note taped to the back. It read, "If you're reading this, don't turn it over. He hates being seen first." No fingerprints on the note. No handwriting match. The house was demolished in 2001. Yet years later, a traveler uploaded a blurry image of the ruins, claiming the mirror was still there, propped against a tree, still intact. A day after the upload, the account was deleted. Curiosity kept growing. Whisper networks of believers began to form, self-proclaimed survivors who claimed to have glimpsed the listener, resisted his pull, and returned. They spoke cryptically, never directly acknowledging what they saw. Their language was coded. The echo smiled first. "I remembered blinking, but not stopping." He doesn't mimic, he learns. Attempts to interview these individuals often ended abruptly. Phones went dead. Meetings were missed. In several cases, investigators reported seeing themselves walking away from the meeting location before they even arrived. Dashcam footage confirmed the bizarre claim, vehicles identical to the investigators seen leaving locations they had never reached. The footage always glitched at exactly 3:17 a.m. Among the most haunting details was the emergence of a sound. A low hum, detectable only in certain frequencies, embedded deep in audio files recorded near reflective surfaces. Spectrogram analysis revealed a repeating waveform shaped like an eye. No known explanation existed. Musicians, when exposed to the tone, reported feeling compelled to harmonize, even involuntarily humming it in their sleep. The hum became a signature, dubbed the listener's breath. Some argued it was the brain interpreting chaos as pattern. Others insisted it was a digital footprint from something older than language. Then came the children's reports. A new thread of the nightmare. Kids under 10, untouched by online rumors, began speaking of the mirror boy, a figure that only appeared when they were alone. Descriptions matched: pale face, slow smile, and eyes that blinked after theirs. Several drew the figure with reversed hands and mouths. One child whispered to her teacher, "He copies wrong on purpose." None of them could say how they knew him. Only that he was from the other side of looking. The implications were no longer confined to myth or madness. Something, or someone, had learned how to use the act of watching as a doorway. A ritual not of candles or blood, but of gaze and silence. And once the eyes locked, it was already happening. The sleep deprivation started subtly. A blink too long, a momentary lapse of focus. People reported nights filled with restless dreams, shadows moving just beyond vision, and a constant feeling of being watched even in the safety of locked rooms. What was once dismissed as mere anxiety soon transformed into something more sinister. Victims described an overwhelming sense of presence, a heavy silence pressing down on their chests, as if the air itself had thickened. Doctors tried to understand the physical toll. Heart rates spiked without reason. Pupils dilated and contracted erratically. Skin crawled with invisible sensations, the unmistakable feeling of fingers tracing cold lines down backs. No medication provided relief. Sleep clinics saw record numbers of patients who, after undergoing sleep studies, refused to leave the darkened rooms, convinced that heat lurked just beyond the glass. One survivor described the nights as a waking nightmare, where every time she closed her eyes, the reflection of a pale boy with unnatural eyes was waiting for her. Not in the mirror, but behind her eyelids, a constant flickering image that blurred and sharpened, taunting her with silent accusations. Her waking hours were spent compulsively checking reflections, windows, and screens, afraid that at any moment the pale boy would step out, breaking the fragile barrier between worlds. This was not hallucination. It was something else entirely. Those who tried to escape their own reflections often found no solace. Mirrors shattered in their presence without cause, cracks spiderwebbing across glass like frozen lightning. Reflections twisted, sometimes delayed by a fraction of a second, moving independently. Some reported seeing their reflection's mouth twitch into a smile before their own lips moved. Others claimed their reflection blinked once and then remained frozen, eyes locked wide open, as if staring into another dimension. The most terrifying accounts came from families. Children reported hearing whispers at night, faint, unintelligible voices calling from the glass. Parents caught their kids speaking to empty mirrors, eyes vacant, lips barely moving. Several children woke screaming after insisting that the pale boy had tried to come in. Attempts to destroy mirrors failed. Broken shards reassembled mysteriously overnight. New mirrors appeared in homes where none had existed before, reflecting scenes that were not present, rooms filled with shadowy figures, empty corridors, and endless darkness. The phenomenon was impossible to explain rationally. In one documented case, a man living alone awoke to find every reflective surface in his apartment covered in a thick layer of frost, as if the cold itself emanated from the reflections. When he peeled back the frost from a small bathroom mirror, the pale boy's face stared back at him, expressionless, lips barely parted. The man fled the apartment, leaving all his belongings behind. When authorities arrived, they found no sign of forced entry, no disturbance, except for the frost-covered mirrors, perfectly intact. The pattern of the occurrences showed no respect for geography or social boundaries. Across the country, reports poured in from urban and rural areas alike. All connected by a shared sense of dread and the same time marker, 3:17 a.m. The hour when the listener's gaze was said to be strongest. The hour when the veil between worlds thinned. Theories emerged, desperate attempts to rationalize the inexplicable. Some suggested a mass psychogenic illness, others proposed a new form of digital age haunt. A few academics speculated about collective unconscious manifestations triggered by the internet's viral power, an emergent entity born from collective fear and attention. But none could explain the damage. The victims' minds deteriorated rapidly. Memories became unreliable, days blended into nights, and identities fractured. Families were torn apart by paranoia and silence. Those who survived the earliest encounters reported losing months to blank voids, waking with no recollection of how they got there, only the lingering sensation that something else was inhabiting their bodies during the lost time. Some found themselves speaking in voices that were not their own. Messages were whispered in dead languages, cryptic warnings that made no sense to anyone but the speaker. One man's recorded confession ended abruptly with him repeating a single phrase over and over, "Don't blink. He's watching." Even technology seemed compromised. Phones displayed distorted faces in selfies taken alone. Cameras caught fleeting shadows that flickered and vanished when reviewed. Audio recordings captured breathing that wasn't theirs, whispers too faint to decipher but too persistent to ignore. The internet became a labyrinth of warning signs and disappearances. Forums once filled with theories and support grew silent or were taken down without explanation. Social media accounts linked to victims vanished overnight. Email inboxes flooded with unread messages from unknown senders containing nothing but mirrored texts and cryptic codes. Then, the disappearances began. No forced entry. No struggle. Just absence. Families found rooms empty where loved ones had slept the night before. Phones left on tables, meals left uneaten. The missing left no trace except for a faint, lingering cold and the inexplicable feeling of being watched. Neighbors reported hearing soft tapping on windows and the faintest outline of a face pressed against glass at impossible hours. Authorities were baffled, unable to connect cases or find leads. Surveillance cameras showed nothing but static during the critical moments. Calls to missing persons remained unanswered. The only clue was the time, 3:17 a.m. Whispers persisted about the pale boy, the listener, being a gatekeeper or a prisoner, a reflection trapped between worlds, seeking release or company. Some said those who disappeared were pulled through the glass, becoming part of the endless reflection, forever watching and waiting. Others believed the listener was not a victim, but a predator, feeding on fear and attention, growing stronger with every glance and every blink missed. And as the nights wore on, the shadows deepened, reflections multiplied, and the boundary between reality and the mirrored world thinned ever more. Because once you look into the mirror long enough, sometimes, it looks back. The more the authorities tried to intervene, the more elusive the phenomenon became. Police investigations stalled amid confusing evidence and vanished witnesses. Cases were quietly archived, classified as unsolvable disappearances or bizarre mental breakdowns, never fully explained. For every lead followed, a dozen more vanished into the void. Law enforcement officers who engaged with families reported feeling watched themselves. Unexplainable cold spots would appear during interviews. Radios crackled with static punctuated by faint whispers. Cameras malfunctioned, footage corrupted just as key moments emerged. Some officers refused to speak of the cases, citing nightmares that invaded their rest, shadows lingering just beyond the edge of vision. A small group of detectives became obsessed with understanding what was happening. They pieced together an unsettling timeline. Victims all had one thing in common: exposure to reflective surfaces at precisely 3:17 a.m. Windows, mirrors, smartphone screens, even puddles or polished metal. The reflective moments were brief but potent, as if the act of looking through those surfaces opened a door. The detectives uncovered urban legends older than the digital age. Stories of a pale figure haunting mirrors, sometimes called the Reflection Man or the Watcher. Legends told of a child trapped in glass, cursed to mimic and copy those who glimpsed him. The ritual to escape was said to be simple yet cruel: do not blink when he looks back. Blinking, they theorized, broke the fragile barrier. It allowed him to slip through, to pull the watcher into his world, a place without light or warmth, an eternal mirror maze from which none returned. One detective discovered a journal from the 1920s, belonging to a man named Jeremiah Collins, a house painter who had documented a similar experience in his own home. Collins wrote of waking nightly at the exact time of 3:17 a.m., hearing whispering from the mirrors, and seeing the pale boy's face pressed against the glass. He described the terror of blinking and waking to find himself unable to move, trapped in an endless reflection of his own nightmare. Collins' last entry was a desperate warning scrawled in shaky handwriting: "Don't trust your eyes. They lie. He watches while you blink." Despite their growing fear, the detectives pushed forward, gathering surveillance footage from victims' homes, piecing together moments before disappearances. Patterns emerged: a flicker in the mirror, a sudden shift in lighting, a momentary lapse in blinking. Each incident followed a heartbeat of silence, an unnatural stillness before the victim vanished. One investigator, driven to the edge by insomnia and obsession, recorded himself through a mirror during his night shifts. At exactly 3:17 a.m., his own reflection blinked before he did, freezing for a split second longer, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The recording cut out seconds later, leaving only static and a faint, chilling breath sound. This investigator was found days later in his apartment, sitting motionless in front of a shattered mirror, eyes wide open but unresponsive. No explanation was ever given. As the phenomenon escalated, technology itself seemed to betray humanity. Digital assistants spoke in reversed phrases. Automated cameras captured impossible reflections, empty rooms showing figures standing behind the lens. Screens flickered with distorted faces, always catching the corners of viewers' eyes. The internet became a double-edged sword, a place where the story spread, but also where the listener thrived. Online forums dedicated to the phenomenon were littered with accounts of terrifying encounters and disappearances. Attempts to debunk or rationalize the events only fueled its reach, as fear and curiosity fed the dark cycle. In a bizarre twist, some victims appeared in photographs and videos found on unknown devices circulating anonymously online. Images showed them in places they never visited, frozen mid-glance at reflective surfaces, their eyes wide with silent terror. The faces in these images were distorted, stretched, and mirrored, like echoes trapped between two realities. A chilling discovery came when digital analysts found that these images contained embedded messages in their code, strings of binary that, when decoded, formed cryptic warnings: "Don't let him see you first. The blink betrays. Watch. Wait. Don't close your eyes." The warnings hinted at a rule of engagement with the entity: how to survive, or at least delay the inevitable. But no one knew how long the delay could last. Every encounter seemed to drain a little more from the victim's soul, as if the listener fed not just on fear, but on presence itself. Rumors spread of a small, clandestine group, those who claimed to have resisted the entity's pull. They called themselves the Watchers, people who had learned to control their blinking, to stare unflinchingly into reflective surfaces at the cursed hour. Some claimed to use specialized glasses, mirrors coated with unknown substances, or ritualistic chants to keep the listener at bay. Yet, even among the Watchers, there was no guarantee of safety. Some disappeared without a trace, others returned changed, haunted, hollow-eyed, their reflections no longer matching their movements. These survivors spoke in riddles, warning of a growing darkness beyond the mirror, a place where the listener's true form waited. The listener, they said, was not just a trapped child or a malevolent spirit. It was an ancient consciousness born from human fear and reflection, a creature existing between light and shadow, made stronger by attention and weakened only by resistance. And the final horror, once the listener had marked you, your own reflection would begin to change. Eyes would shift, smiles would falter, movements would lag. The reflection became a separate entity, learning your habits, your fears, your secrets. You might see your reflection step out of sync. You might catch it mimicking you after you stopped moving. It was watching, waiting for the moment you blinked, the moment you faltered. Because in that instant, the listener claimed another soul, and the cycle began anew. The more people tried to warn others, the deeper the darkness seemed to grow. Panic spread quietly, like a shadow creeping across a once bright surface. Families stopped using mirrors at night, bedrooms were stripped of reflective objects, and screens were covered or turned off well before midnight. Yet, the disappearances continued. The listener's reach was relentless and patient. Attempts to resist often ended in tragedy. Some who refused to blink into the reflection at the cursed hour found themselves trapped in endless cycles of staring contests, eyes bloodshot and dry, minds fraying at the edges. Their bodies grew weak, but their terror never waned. The longer they stared, the more the pale boy's image shifted, once innocent, now twisted with malice. There were rumors of survivors who claimed to have glimpsed beyond the surface, to a dark mirror realm where the laws of physics were warped. A place where echoes of lost souls wandered, trapped in endless corridors lined with infinite reflections. Time didn't pass normally there, minutes could stretch into years, and days could collapse into seconds. This mirror realm was a prison and a feeding ground. The listener was not alone there but the master of this reflection world, feeding on the fear and despair of those ensnared. It was said that the listener could manipulate reflections to lure victims deeper, using familiar faces, voices, or memories to trap them. One chilling account came from a man who escaped the mirror realm, only to disappear weeks later. He described the experience as being pulled into his own reflection, walking through a dark labyrinth where every mirror showed a different version of himself, some broken, some smiling cruelly, others pleading for help. The pale boy was always watching, waiting in the shadows, promising release but delivering only torment. Those who tried to communicate with the listener reported strange effects. Phones would ring with no caller ID, playing distorted lullabies. Voices echoed through empty rooms, sometimes whispering names, sometimes repeating the phrase, "Don't blink. Don't look away." Attempts to record these voices often ended with equipment destroyed or erased. The listener seemed bound to reflection itself. Photographs became gateways, images taken by victims were often corrupted with strange distortions, faces melting, eyes reflecting unnatural light. Screens displayed glitches that resembled the pale boy's face, but always just at the edge of perception. This symbiosis between technology and the supernatural had never been seen before. It suggested an entity evolving with the modern world, learning how to use mirrors, cameras, and screens to extend its influence. No one knew if it had a true origin or if it had simply always existed, waiting for humanity to perfect its reflections. The internet was both a curse and a resource. The more people searched for answers, the more the listener fed on their fear and attention. Online, stories spread like wildfire, testimonies, warnings, and urban legends combined into a dark digital tapestry. Some tried to debunk the phenomenon, but skeptics often vanished or recanted under mysterious circumstances. Some researchers attempted to confront the entity through rituals and technology combined. Experiments using infrared cameras, specialized lenses, and ancient incantations were conducted in abandoned houses where disappearances had occurred. Results were inconclusive, often ending with equipment failing or researchers fleeing in terror. One notable attempt involved a paranormal team filming a 24-hour vigil in a house known as the Mirror House, where multiple disappearances had taken place. The footage showed nothing unusual until exactly 3:17 a.m., when every reflective surface in the house simultaneously flickered with a faint pale glow. The cameras then captured a chilling moment, a faint outline of a small figure moving against the glass, eyes glowing, before the feeds cut to static. When the team tried to leave, they found the house's layout had inexplicably changed. Rooms twisted into impossible shapes, corridors stretched endlessly, and mirrors multiplied. Panic set in as members realized the house was no longer bound by normal reality. They escaped only after breaking a large mirror with a sledgehammer, shattering the illusion. But the damage was done. Each member of the team reported nightmares and a persistent feeling of being followed by something unseen. One vanished without explanation weeks later, leaving behind a video message in which he whispered frantically, "He's in the reflections. Don't blink. Don't blink." Those who survived the phenomenon carried scars deeper than physical wounds. Their reflections no longer matched perfectly, subtle delays in movement, strange smiles, eyes that didn't quite align. Families noticed their loved ones acting strangely, as if controlled by unseen forces, their voices sometimes distant or hollow. Psychologists were baffled. They diagnosed mass trauma, dissociative episodes, or shared delusions. But medical explanations fell short in the face of undeniable physical evidence: shattered mirrors reassembling overnight, electronics behaving erratically, and multiple eyewitness accounts. The public's fear grew, fueled by viral videos and news reports. Entire communities began removing mirrors from homes, stores stopped selling reflective glass, and a black market for mirrorless furniture appeared. Religious groups held midnight vigils, praying for protection from what they called the reflection demon. The listener's curse became a modern plague, unseen, unstoppable, and ever watchful. It thrived in the gap between reality and reflection, in the flicker of an eye, in the hesitation to look away. And yet, the most terrifying truth remained unspoken. No one knew how the cycle began, why the pale boy was trapped, or if there was any way to end it. Because the longer the listener waited, the stronger it grew. Each blink, each stolen glance, was a small surrender. And in the end, surrender meant joining the endless gallery of reflections, trapped forever behind the glass, watching others blink, and waiting for the moment to claim them next. The truth about the listener's origins remained shrouded in mystery, but the deeper investigators delved, the more disturbing the connections became. Historical records suggested that the phenomenon was not new. Accounts of people vanishing after staring into mirrors date back centuries, cloaked in folklore and superstition. But the recent surge in disappearances coincided with the rise of digital technology and mass use of reflective surfaces in everyday life. The mirror was more than just glass, it had become a portal. Some theorists believed that humanity's obsession with its own image, countless selfies, screens, and reflections, had awakened something dormant. The listener was feeding on this obsession, growing stronger with every shared image, every glance captured and stored. Ancient texts hinted at a curse tied to reflection itself, a punishment for vanity and pride. In some cultures, mirrors were covered after a death to prevent spirits from crossing over. Others warned against gazing into mirrors at night, lest one invite a ghost or demon into their home. These old beliefs, once dismissed as superstition, gained new relevance as the modern crisis unfolded. What terrified experts most was the listener's method of selecting victims. It seemed to sense fear and curiosity in equal measure, honing in on those who looked too long, those who tried to understand or control it. Curiosity was a trap. The more one sought to know, the closer the listener became. Families told stories of loved ones becoming obsessed with the cursed hour, compulsively watching clocks as they approached 3:17 a.m., unable to resist the pull of the mirror. Some barricaded themselves away from reflective surfaces, only to be found days later, eyes wide open, frozen in place, their reflections eerily absent. The phenomenon wasn't limited to any single location. Disappearances were reported worldwide, from quiet rural towns to sprawling urban centers. No demographic was immune. The listener's reach crossed age, gender, and culture, uniting its victims in shared terror. Law enforcement struggled to explain or contain the cases. Departments set up task forces dedicated to mirror-related incidents, but evidence was often circumstantial, lacking any forensic proof. Without bodies, without clear cause, the disappearances became cold cases. Public panic was kept from boiling over by silence and skepticism. Governments avoided acknowledging the phenomenon openly, fearing mass hysteria. News outlets gave it little coverage, dismissing eyewitnesses as unreliable or mentally ill. Yet, in private, officials held urgent meetings, debating how to respond to a threat no one understood. Meanwhile, underground groups formed, driven by desperation and fear. These groups exchanged information and rituals designed to protect against the listener, sharing stories of ancient practices rediscovered or invented anew. Some believed that to defeat the listener, one had to break the cycle of reflection entirely. A ritual surfaced among these circles. To avoid the curse, one must shatter every reflective surface in their home before 3:17 a.m. and remain in darkness until dawn. Some claimed this worked, at least temporarily, but it came with its own risks. Deprivation of light and normal daily functions took a heavy toll on mental health. Others believed that confronting the listener head-on was the only way to survive. They advocated for staring unblinking into the reflection, refusing to look away, matching the pale boy's gaze until dawn. This deadly game of wills was said to confuse or repel the entity, but the strain on the mind and body was immense. Stories of people who attempted this ritual were chilling. Many went mad from exhaustion or sleep deprivation, their eyes bloodshot and swollen. Some vanished mid-ritual, their reflections remaining behind in mirrors or screens, trapped as permanent prisoners. The psychological toll extended beyond the direct victims. Entire communities were gripped by paranoia. People stopped attending social events at night, abandoned homes with mirrors, and turned off all devices before the cursed hour. The listener had succeeded in isolating its prey, breaking down social bonds. Researchers in psychology and parapsychology studied the effects, noting a collective trauma spreading like a contagion. Fear mutated into obsession, and obsession into madness. Even those who had never seen the listener began to experience symptoms of anxiety and paranoia. Despite the mounting evidence, the ultimate question remained unanswered: what was the listener truly? A malevolent spirit? A parasitic consciousness born from human fear? Or something far older and stranger, a force that existed beyond human understanding? One chilling hypothesis suggested that the listener was a fragment of humanity's collective shadow, the dark side of self-awareness, born from the reflection of our own inner fears. It was not just a ghost or demon, but a mirror to the darkness inside every soul, waiting for the moment we blink, when our guard drops. This theory explained why the listener targeted those who looked too long, those who were most vulnerable. It was drawn to the fear and doubt within, feeding on the fractured selves caught between reality and reflection. As this nightmare continued to spread, some wondered if humanity itself had become trapped in a vast mirror maze, each reflection a doorway to madness and disappearance. The listener was no longer just a local terror, it was a global curse, a relentless predator feeding on our need to see ourselves. The question that haunted everyone was whether there was a way out. Could the cycle be broken? Or was every blink, every glance into a reflective surface, another step closer to becoming part of the endless gallery? In the shadows of this growing darkness, one fact remained clear: the listener was watching. Patient, waiting, ready to claim the next soul, brave, or foolish, enough to meet its gaze. The more people disappeared, the louder the whispers became. Those who had survived close encounters with the listener began sharing fragmented warnings, cryptic, desperate, and terrifying. Their voices trembled with urgency as they described subtle shifts in the world around them, changes so slight most would dismiss them, but those attuned could feel the creeping presence of something unnatural. Objects began to behave oddly. Mirrors would fog inexplicably even in dry rooms. Reflections sometimes lagged behind the movements of their owners, twisting just out of sync. People reported catching glimpses of shapes moving behind them, only to turn and find nothing there. Phones rang without callers. Screens flickered with ghostly faces, pale and unmoving, staring back like the boy in the mirror. These phenomena weren't isolated incidents. They formed a pattern, a sinister signature left by the listener as it stretched its influence beyond mere reflections. It was as if the barrier between the real world and the mirror realm was thinning, fracturing. Researchers began speaking of a threshold, a fragile border where reality blurred. The more victims lost, the weaker this threshold became. Each disappearance was like a piece of that border cracking, allowing the listener more freedom to cross over and manifest in our world. The implications were horrifying. If the listener gained enough power to fully cross over, the world as people knew it could become a waking nightmare, with reflections no longer safe windows but gateways for darkness. Communities tried to adapt. Rituals once confined to folklore re-emerged in desperate attempts to push back. Salt lines were drawn across thresholds. Mirrors were wrapped in cloth or hidden away. People covered their windows at night and avoided shiny surfaces entirely. But the listener was relentless, adapting and evolving. It seemed to learn from each failed attempt, growing smarter, more cunning. It began using reflections not just to lure victims but to communicate, through warped images, whispered voices, and symbols etched into glass. These communications were cryptic but unmistakably a message. It was aware, it was watching, and it was patient. It wanted something, though no one knew what. Some theorized that the listener sought release, trapped in the mirror realm for centuries, bound by unknown forces, craving freedom at any cost. Others believed it sought to replace the living, to pull more souls into its dark domain, expanding its influence indefinitely. Theories aside, one fact remained undeniable: the listener's power was growing, and its hunger insatiable. In this climate of fear, people clung to hope where they could find it. Stories circulated of survivors who had managed to outwit the listener, escaping its grasp by mastering control over their own reflections. These survivors had learned to move beyond fear, breaking the spell of obsession that gave the listener strength. By refusing to see themselves as victims and confronting the terror head-on, they claimed a fragile victory. Their methods varied. Some used meditation and mental discipline to steady their gaze, others employed talismans and charms made of obsidian or onyx, believed to repel dark spirits tied to mirrors. A few practiced reflection denial, avoiding all mirrors and reflective surfaces for weeks or months. But these were dangerous paths, fraught with risk and uncertainty. Few could endure the isolation and paranoia such measures demanded. Even as some found temporary respite, the listener continued to hunt. Its presence lingered in the shadows, a constant reminder that the nightmare was far from over. With every new disappearance, the line between reality and reflection blurred further. Families shattered, friendships dissolved, and communities fell into mistrust. No one knew who might be next. The listener did not discriminate. It could strike anywhere, at any time, in homes, on the streets, in offices, or schools. It thrived in silence and darkness, in the spaces between blinks. And as the cursed hour approached each night, a chilling certainty settled over the world. When the clock strikes 3:17 a.m., the nightmare begins anew. Fear evolved into obsession. Entire lives became consumed by the cursed hour and the looming threat of the listener. People began counting down the minutes before 3:17 a.m., barricading themselves in rooms free of mirrors and glass. Some tore out windows, broke picture frames, even discarded smartphones and tablets, anything capable of reflecting an image. Yet, no matter the precautions, the dread never fully vanished. Sleep was a rare commodity. Nightmares plagued many, visions of endless hallways lined with mirrors, each reflecting impossible, distorted versions of themselves. Some dreamt of the pale boy's face, his eyes hollow but filled with silent accusation, beckoning them to look closer. Waking hours blurred with dreams, paranoia grew rampant. The simplest glance toward a reflective surface became an act of courage, or madness. The social fabric frayed as families grew suspicious. Parents feared their children's compulsions to stare into glass, siblings accused one another of summoning the entity. Neighborhoods erected unofficial curfews, strangers were eyed warily, as if the listener might use human proxies to spread its influence. Public officials struggled to maintain calm. Emergency hotlines swelled with calls from frantic citizens reporting fleeting reflections that moved on their own, voices whispering from behind bathroom mirrors, and sudden disappearances with no trace. Mental health crises surged. Therapists faced overwhelming demand, with many patients convinced they were marked by the listener. Underground forums flourished, places where fear could be shared and theories exchanged. But these hubs were double-edged swords. While some offered comfort, others propagated dangerous misinformation and rituals. Desperate individuals experimented with forbidden practices, including mirror-breaking ceremonies that sometimes ended in self-harm or worse. A particularly disturbing trend emerged: mirror watchers. These were thrill-seekers and conspiracy theorists who deliberately stared into mirrors at 3:17 a.m., hoping to glimpse the listener or even communicate with it. Videos circulated online showing distorted faces and strange shadows captured in reflections, stoking the frenzy. The authorities condemned such actions but often found themselves powerless. Arrests were rare and ineffective. The listener's power transcended conventional laws and reason. Experts cautioned that provoking the entity only strengthened it, turning curiosity into fuel. Yet curiosity was a primal force. The need to understand, to control what was beyond comprehension, drove many into reckless confrontation. Stories spread of people who vanished while attempting to capture proof on cameras or phones. Some left cryptic final messages pleading for help, others simply disappeared without a trace. Amid the chaos, a new theory gained traction, a potential link between the listener and certain locations marked by tragic histories. Old houses, abandoned asylums, forgotten prisons, sites of mass tragedy seemed to act as focal points. Survivors reported heightened activity near such places, with reflections behaving even more erratically. This connection sparked a grim hope that the listener might be bound to these sites, anchored by residual pain and anguish. Researchers began exploring ways to sever these ties, hoping that cleansing rituals or symbolic closures might weaken the entity. Some communities held memorials, lighting candles and offering prayers to the lost souls, attempting to restore peace to haunted grounds. Others performed symbolic mirror burials, burying shards deep underground to contain the curse. While these acts offered solace, they did little to stop the disappearances. The listener was no simple ghost but a force adapting beyond expectations. Psychologists debated the collective trauma, suggesting the listener might be a shared manifestation of societal fear, grief, and guilt, a dark mirror reflecting humanity's shadow self. If so, its power was a symptom of deeper wounds, requiring healing far beyond rituals and superstition. Meanwhile, families of the missing clung to hope. Private investigators, paranormal experts, and even psychics were hired to find answers. Some sought ancient texts, others pursued cutting-edge technology, but all encountered frustration. The cold cases mounted. Missing persons reports grew into mountains of unanswered questions. The only clues were fractured reflections, whispered warnings, and the cursed hour ticking ever closer. And still, every night at 3:17 a.m., the listener waited. As the days turned into weeks, a chilling pattern emerged within the disappearances. It wasn't random, the victims all shared something subtle yet profound, an unshakable fixation on mirrors or reflections. Some had histories of self-obsession, others suffered from deep insecurities, and a few even reportedly practiced mirror gazing as a form of meditation or self-exploration. Whether conscious or not, they had all spent long, uninterrupted moments staring into reflective surfaces in the hours leading up to their vanishing. This fixation seemed to tether them to the listener's realm. The more one focused on their reflection, the thinner the veil between realities became. Obsession turned into vulnerability, an open invitation. The listener did not merely take, it consumed. It fed on the fractured identity reflected back, pulling victims deeper into its domain, where distorted echoes of themselves awaited. Some theorized the entity fragmented souls, trapping pieces inside mirrors, leaving behind hollow shells or blank reflections. Researchers found unsettling parallels in ancient folklore. Across cultures, mirrors have long been feared as portals to other worlds or as traps for spirits. Legends spoke of entities that could steal one's reflection, imprisoning it and leaving the person a soulless husk, wandering aimlessly. These myths echoed eerily in the present crisis. One hypothesis posited that the listener was a remnant of an ancient curse, a vengeful spirit bound to mirror realms, growing stronger with each soul it claimed. Others suspected it was a parasitic entity, drawn to the human psyche's darkest corners, thriving on insecurity and fear. Efforts to break the cycle intensified. Specialists recommended reducing mirror exposure, but this advice proved nearly impossible in modern life. Mirrors were everywhere, in homes, cars, workplaces, even phones and computers. To counteract this, some devised mirror shields, coverings or films that blurred or obscured reflections, making it harder for the listener to reach through. While not foolproof, these offered some psychological relief. Still, the listener found ways to circumvent even these barriers. It manipulated light and shadows, appeared in unexpected surfaces, puddles, polished metal, darkened windows, anywhere reflections might hide. This adaptability sowed further dread. The very act of seeing became suspect. What was real, and what was a trick? How could one trust their own eyes when reflections might be gateways to horror? Amid this uncertainty, an underground movement arose, composed of those determined to fight back. Calling themselves the Reflectors, they sought to understand the listener through ancient texts, scientific inquiry, and experimental rituals. The Reflectors believed knowledge was power. They mapped disappearance sites, documented strange phenomena, and attempted communication through controlled mirror-gazing sessions, hoping to glean clues from the entity itself. Their methods were perilous, walking the fine line between contact and entrapment. Some members vanished, fueling rumors that the listener was retaliating. Yet, some claimed breakthroughs. A few reported hearing whispers not of menace, but of warning, cryptic phrases hinting at the listener's origins and weaknesses. The messages suggested that the entity was bound by ancient rites, vulnerable to certain symbols and sounds. Based on these whispers, the Reflectors experimented with rituals involving salt, iron, and specific tonal frequencies. These attempts occasionally disrupted the listener's influence in localized areas, giving fleeting moments of peace. However, such successes were fragile. The listener's core power remained, anchored deep within the fractured reflection realm, growing as it waited patiently for its next opportunity. In the midst of this struggle, a horrifying truth surfaced: the listener was not only consuming individuals but also altering the fabric of reality around it. Time anomalies, déjà vu episodes, and inexplicable changes in physical spaces suggested a creeping distortion, a bleed-through of the mirror realm into the real world. Entire buildings reportedly shifted layout overnight, hallways looping impossibly, rooms appearing where none existed before. Witnesses described seeing their own reflections act independently, moving in ways that contradicted their physical bodies. These distortions disoriented residents, making escape and rescue difficult. The listener was reshaping its domain, expanding the threshold until it could step fully into the human world. Scientists and occult experts alike warned that this was a point of no return. If the listener's influence grew unchecked, it could usher in an age where reflections became prisons, and reality itself a haunted labyrinth. Desperation permeated communities. Some opted for evacuation from hotspots, abandoning homes and businesses to the growing darkness. Others fortified their living spaces with ritual protections, hoping to buy time. Meanwhile, governments scrambled to contain panic, often downplaying the severity. Official reports labeled much of the activity as mass hysteria or mental health crises, unwilling or unable to admit the supernatural threat. This denial left ordinary people vulnerable, isolated, and fearful. Trust in institutions eroded further, and conspiracy theories flourished. Despite the overwhelming odds, glimmers of hope persisted. A few brave souls continued to fight, armed with knowledge, courage, and an unyielding will to reclaim their reflections. The battle between light and shadow waged on, a silent war waged in the glimmering surfaces of mirrors everywhere. And as the cursed hour approached once again, the world held its breath, knowing that at 3:17 a.m., the listener's nightmare would rise anew. The toll on those left behind was immeasurable. Families shattered, communities broken by grief and fear that refused to fade with the daylight. Every missing person was a wound carved into the heart of society, a chilling reminder that the listener's reach extended beyond the veil of night. Parents clung to photographs, haunted by the blank spaces where their loved ones once stood. Friends whispered in hushed tones about last conversations, small signs of impending doom that none had recognized until it was too late. Among these survivors, a few found themselves drawn into a new, desperate quest, to find a way to reverse the horror, to retrieve those stolen souls from the listener's clutches. The reflectors' efforts evolved from mere research and ritual to active rescue missions. Armed with fragments of arcane knowledge and makeshift talismans, small teams ventured into the places where victims were last seen, searching for traces beyond the physical world. These missions were dangerous, undertaken at the dead of night when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. The air grew heavy, distorted by an unseen presence that whispered threats and lured them deeper into twisted corridors of reflection. Time and space folded erratically, and the familiar transformed into the grotesque. Yet, the determination to reclaim lost souls outweighed the fear. Some teams reported fleeting glimpses of those trapped, distorted reflections caught in liminal spaces, eyes wide with terror, mouths opening silently as if pleading for rescue. Communicating with them proved nearly impossible. The listener's influence severed most attempts at connection. Those who came closest to liberation often paid a steep price. Some vanished without trace, others returned broken, their minds fractured by the glimpse of the abyss. Those who survived spoke of a dark force that could warp reality itself, bending human will and distorting memories. Among these brave souls was a young investigator named Marcus, whose sister had disappeared months earlier. He became obsessed with understanding the listener, poring over folklore, scientific theories, and first-hand accounts. Marcus believed the key lay in understanding the entity's origins, its true nature hidden beneath layers of myth and fear. He discovered references to an ancient ritual, performed centuries ago by a secretive order known only as the Guardians of the Mirror. This group had sought to imprison the entity within a network of enchanted mirrors scattered across sacred sites. The ritual involved complex symbols, rare materials, and precise timing, meant to bind the listener and sever its influence over the living. However, the ritual was incomplete, fractured over generations, and the locations of these mirrors had been lost or destroyed. Without the full ceremony, the listener's power had grown unchecked, feeding off modern fears and obsessions. Marcus's investigation led him to a remote town where some of these sacred mirrors were rumored to remain. The town itself was shrouded in eerie silence, its residents wary and secretive. Strange phenomena were common, reflections behaving independently, sudden cold spots, and shadows that moved with unnatural grace. Here, Marcus found allies among a small group of locals who still honored the old ways. Together, they sought to piece together the ritual, gathering fragments of ancient texts and artifacts. The effort was painstaking and fraught with setbacks, but hope flickered in their hearts. As they delved deeper, they uncovered disturbing evidence that the listener was aware of their plans. Attacks intensified, subtle manipulations that frayed nerves and distorted perceptions. Team members reported waking to find symbols scratched into walls, mirrors cracked in unnatural patterns, and whispered voices beckoning them to give up. The line between ally and enemy blurred as paranoia took hold. The listener seemed to sow discord, turning friends against one another through hallucinations and fear. Yet, Marcus's resolve never wavered. The memory of his sister propelled him forward, a beacon in the growing darkness. The final step required performing the binding ritual precisely at the cursed hour, 3:17 a.m., when the listener's power peaked but its vulnerability was greatest. Failure meant unleashing the entity's full wrath, success promised salvation. On the chosen night, the group assembled in a hidden chamber lined with ancient mirrors, each one a portal and a prison. Candles flickered, casting trembling light on the intricate symbols inscribed on the floor. Heartbeats thundered as the ritual began, voices chanting long-forgotten words meant to seal the breach between worlds. For a moment, the air stilled. The mirrors shimmered, reflections warping and twisting as if struggling against invisible chains. Then, a scream pierced the silence, a sound unlike any earthly cry, full of rage and despair. The chamber trembled as the listener resisted, fighting to break free. Shadows writhed and flickered, reaching out like tendrils seeking escape. Some mirrors shattered, fragments scattering across the floor with sharp, ringing echoes. Despite the chaos, the ritual continued. The ancient symbols glowed faintly, pushing back the darkness inch by inch. Time seemed to dilate, minutes stretching into eternity as the battle unfolded on the edge of reality. When dawn finally broke, the mirrors grew still. The oppressive weight lifted, and a fragile peace settled. Some reflections returned to normal, others remained blank, but the immediate threat was quelled. Marcus and his allies emerged from the chamber, exhausted but victorious. Though the listener's presence lingered like a shadow, its power had been diminished, restrained for now. The missing were not all recovered, and the scars left behind would never fully heal. The listener remained a threat, a reminder that some darkness endures beyond time. Yet, hope had been rekindled, proof that even the most terrifying nightmare could be challenged, that the fractured light of humanity could still pierce through the deepest shadow. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in months, the world dared to breathe again. The victory over the listener's immediate onslaught gave a false sense of security. Though its power was diminished, it had not been destroyed, and that knowledge weighed heavily on those who had witnessed its fury firsthand. The entity's influence lingered, subtle yet insidious, creeping back into the world through shadows and broken reflections. It was a remnant of an ancient darkness, patient and cunning, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Marcus understood that the ritual was only a temporary restraint. The listener had been bound, but not eradicated. To truly end its reign, they needed to find the source, the origin of the curse that tethered it to their world. This meant traveling deeper into forgotten history, where fact and legend blurred into a labyrinth of secrets. Old manuscripts spoke of a time before mirrors were common household items, when reflections were rare and held sacred meaning. It was said that the first mirror was created by an ancient civilization that sought to capture not just images, but souls, a tool for power and control. The listener was born from this dark magic, a corrupted guardian meant to protect but twisted into a ravenous predator. Archaeological sites hinted at ruins beneath modern cities, places where the original mirrors had been kept or hidden away to contain the entity. These ruins were buried beneath layers of earth and time, lost to history but marked in obscure texts by symbols recognized only by those who had studied the phenomenon. Marcus assembled a team of experts, historians, occult scholars, and engineers skilled in advanced scanning technologies. Their mission was to locate these ancient sites and recover relics or knowledge that could help sever the listener's hold permanently. Their search took them across continents, from cold, mist-covered forests to sun-scorched deserts. Each site revealed fragments of the past, shattered stones inscribed with cryptic runes, metallic shards rumored to be pieces of the original mirrors, and faded murals depicting the entity in terrifying forms. As they explored these ruins, the team encountered increasing resistance. Unexplainable malfunctions in their equipment, sudden drops in temperature, and sensations of being watched became commonplace. Some team members began to experience disturbing visions, glimpses of their own reflections twisting into grotesque masks, whispering threats or desperate pleas. The psychological toll was immense. Fear gnawed at their minds, but so did determination. They knew that uncovering the truth was their only hope for survival and salvation. One breakthrough came when the team discovered an ancient chamber beneath a crumbling temple, filled with inscriptions detailing a counter-ritual, a method to cleanse the original mirror shards and bind the listener's essence into a vessel that could be destroyed. This vessel was described as a prism crafted from purified crystal, capable of capturing and containing supernatural forces. However, crafting such a prism required rare materials scattered across the globe, some hidden in places fraught with danger and guarded by ancient curses. Collecting these materials became a race against time, as the listener's influence continued to spread, causing more disappearances and fractures in reality. Among the materials was a rare mineral found only in deep caves beneath frozen tundras, known for its ability to refract not just light, but spiritual energy. Another was an ancient metal forged in volcanic fire, said to be unbreakable and conductive of mystical forces. The last required ingredient was a drop of water from a spring believed to be blessed by forgotten deities, a source of purity strong enough to counteract the listener's corruption. Each retrieval mission tested the team's resolve. They faced natural hazards, hostile locals fearful of disturbing the past, and manifestations of the listeners' wrath that tried to halt their progress. Marcus's leadership was crucial. His personal loss fueled his relentless pursuit, but he also carried the burden of responsibility for his team's safety. Tension sometimes flared, but the shared goal kept them united. As they gathered the final pieces, signs of the listeners' desperation increased. More intense distortions appeared, entire neighborhoods caught in loops of repeating events, reflections that moved independently with malevolent intent, and horrifying apparitions that appeared to warn them to stop. The entity's voice began to infiltrate their dreams and waking moments alike, promising torment and eternal imprisonment should they continue. Yet, the team pressed on, steeling themselves against the psychological assault. Back at their base, the crafting of the prism commenced. It was a delicate process, blending ancient knowledge with modern precision. The prism had to be flawless, its facets aligned perfectly to trap and shatter the listener's essence. When the prism was finally complete, a sense of grim anticipation settled over the group. The final confrontation loomed, the attempt to draw the listener fully into the mortal realm and imprison it within the prism, where it could be destroyed forever. The ritual required precise timing and immense concentration. It would take place at the heart of the most corrupted site, where the veil between worlds was thinnest. Failure meant unleashing the entity's full fury upon the world. As the night approached, the team prepared mentally and physically, knowing that whatever happened, nothing would be the same again. The listener, ancient and relentless, waited in the shadows, its nightmare far from over. The night of the final ritual was unlike any other. The air was thick with anticipation and an unsettling silence that seemed to swallow every sound. The place chosen was a ruin long forsaken, a crumbling cathedral swallowed by ivy and shadows, its shattered stained glass windows casting fractured colors onto cracked stone floors. This was the epicenter of the listener's power, where the veil between worlds was weakest, and where the entity's hold on reality had been strongest for centuries. The team moved with careful precision, setting up the prism at the center of the ruined nave, surrounded by the ancient mirrors they had recovered from across the globe. Each mirror, a fragment of the original containment, pulsed faintly with residual energy. Together, they formed a lattice of light and shadow, a cage meant to ensnare what was beyond comprehension. The ritual required a sequence of incantations spoken in a long-forgotten tongue, each word a key unlocking layers of metaphysical chains. As the chanting began, the air vibrated with energy, growing heavier with each verse. The fragile boundary between worlds shimmered, a translucent curtain trembling with unseen force. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. Breath became visible as icy tendrils crept along the edges of the mirrors. The shadows deepened, lengthening and twisting, as if alive and conscious. The listener responded. A deafening roar echoed through the cathedral, a sound not of this world, somewhere between a scream, a growl, and the grinding of stone. It reverberated in the bones of every person present, igniting primal terror that clawed at their minds. From the darkness, distorted shapes emerged, twisted reflections of those who had been taken, faceless, shifting figures writhing in eternal torment. They reached out through the cracks in reality, desperate to escape, their anguish palpable. The team held firm, voices steady despite the rising chaos. The prism caught the light of the mirrors, refracting it into a kaleidoscope of colors that danced across the walls, forming a cage of brilliance around the spectral forms. The listener manifested in the center of this maelstrom, an ever-changing visage of nightmare, sometimes a gaping maw lined with teeth like shattered glass, sometimes a void swallowing all light, other times the hollow eyes of a reflection gone mad. It lashed out, tendrils of shadow sweeping through the chamber, aiming to shatter the mirrors and disperse the containment. One of the mirrors cracked, splintering with a sound like bones breaking. Panic threatened to overwhelm the group, but Marcus's voice cut through the fear. He directed them to reinforce the lattice, adjusting the positions of the remaining mirrors to redirect the prism's light. Their coordinated efforts stabilized the cage, but the entity's rage was relentless. The ritual intensified, requiring the team to sacrifice their own strength. Fatigue set in rapidly, muscles trembling, voices hoarse. Some began to see illusions, faces of lost loved ones, promises of escape or peace if they stopped. The listener's most dangerous weapon was doubt, sowing discord from within. Marcus fought against these illusions with every ounce of willpower. He recalled the empty chair at his family's dinner table, the unanswered calls, the silence that had haunted his days since his sister's disappearance. That memory steeled him, forging a resolve stronger than fear. Hours passed, though time felt distorted, a fluid concept within the cathedral's walls. Slowly, the light from the prism grew brighter, the cage tightening. The listener screamed, a sound that shook the foundation, splitting stone and shattering glass, before it was drawn irresistibly toward the prism's heart. A final burst of light blinded everyone, an explosion of pure energy that sent shockwaves through the ruin. When vision returned, the entity was gone, sealed within the crystal prison. The air grew warmer, lighter, the oppressive weight lifting as dawn's first light filtered through the broken windows. Exhausted but triumphant, the team gathered around the prism. The object pulsed softly, a reminder that their victory was not an end, but a beginning. The listener's essence was contained, but only for as long as the prism remained intact. Marcus realized the burden of guardianship now rested on their shoulders, to protect the prison and prevent the entity's release. The knowledge was both a victory and a curse, a constant reminder that darkness never truly dies. Outside, the world stirred awake, oblivious to the night's epic battle waged in silence. Yet the scars would remain, etched into those who fought and into the very fabric of reality. The story of the listener was far from over. It was a nightmare sealed for now, but nightmares have a way of returning, lurking just beyond the edge of the mirror, waiting for a crack to slip through again. The days that followed the ritual were marked by a fragile calm, a deceptive peace that hung like a thin veil over the world. The prism, now encased in a specially designed containment unit, was secured in a remote facility where it could be guarded and studied. Yet despite their best efforts, an unsettling feeling persisted, a sense that something was not quite right, that the victory had come at a cost deeper than anyone had anticipated. Marcus found himself haunted by dreams, visions so vivid they blurred the lines between sleep and wakefulness. In these dreams, the listener was never truly gone. Instead, it whispered from behind fractured glass, promising return and vengeance. The voices were chillingly familiar, echoes of his sister's last words, pleas for help, distorted and twisted by the entity's malevolent will. At the containment site, strange phenomena began to occur. Sensors recorded spikes in energy, inexplicable fluctuations that defied scientific explanation. Equipment malfunctioned without cause, and shadows seemed to move just beyond the edges of vision. Even the most skeptical scientists on the team could not deny the eerie signs. Rumors leaked to the outside world, whispers of a secretive project and unexplained disappearances near the facility. Media speculation fueled paranoia, and local residents reported seeing ghostly figures wandering the woods around the compound at night. Marcus grappled with the realization that their actions, meant to protect, might have unleashed something worse. The containment unit held the listener, but perhaps it was not a prison, maybe it was a beacon, a lure drawing the entity's attention and stirring its rage. The team convened in urgent meetings, debating the next steps. Some argued for destroying the prism outright, fearing the risk of an eventual breach. Others believed that the knowledge contained within was too valuable to lose, that understanding the listener's nature was key to preventing future disasters. Marcus sided with neither extreme. He insisted on vigilance and preparation, knowing that whatever lay ahead would test their limits again. Meanwhile, reports surfaced of new disappearances in nearby towns, young people vanishing without trace, their last known locations marked by strange symbols etched into walls or carved into trees. The patterns matched those associated with the listener's earlier manifestations. Local law enforcement was baffled, unable to connect the dots or offer explanations. Marcus and his team quietly shared information with trusted officials, working behind the scenes to contain panic and control the narrative. One night, as Marcus reviewed footage from surveillance cameras around the containment site, he noticed a distortion, a fleeting ripple, like a shadow slipping through the air. The prism's glow dimmed momentarily, then flared back to full intensity. Heart pounding, he alerted the security team. That same night, an alarm blared. The containment unit's protective field had been compromised. Security personnel rushed to the scene but found no signs of forced entry. The prism remained in place, but its energy readings were off the charts. An emergency lockdown was initiated. Marcus and the experts scrambled to diagnose the anomaly, only to discover that the listener's influence was growing stronger, reaching out through the prism to manipulate the physical world. The entity's power had become less tethered, no longer confined solely to shadows and reflections but now able to exert itself across dimensions, affecting electronics, twisting reality itself. Panic threatened to overtake the team, but Marcus maintained control. They intensified security protocols, implemented new safeguards, and began researching ways to reinforce the prism's containment. As the days stretched on, Marcus grew increasingly isolated, burdened by the knowledge that the battle was far from over. His personal life frayed under the weight of responsibility, friends drifted away, unable to comprehend the darkness he faced daily. In moments of solitude, he questioned the cost of their mission. Had their attempt to imprison the listener only fueled its hunger? Was the nightmare destined to repeat itself, cycling endlessly between containment and escape? One evening, while poring over ancient texts in his private study, Marcus stumbled upon a passage previously overlooked, a warning that the prism was not a final solution but a vessel meant to be destroyed only at a precise moment, under conditions lost to time. Without that knowledge, the containment could backfire, feeding the listener's power rather than diminishing it. Desperation compelled Marcus to seek answers beyond academic study. He reached out to experts in obscure fields, spiritual mediums, folklore historians, even reclusive mystics rumored to have battled similar forces. Through these contacts, a chilling theory emerged: the listener's true nature was that of a parasitic nightmare, feeding off human fear and sorrow, growing stronger with every attempt to trap it. The prism acted as a beacon, amplifying the very energies the entity needed. The only way to break the cycle, the mystics claimed, was to confront the source of the curse itself, the ancient mirror that had birthed the listener, and destroy it in a ritual of sacrifice and forgiveness. But the mirror's location was unknown, lost to history and buried beneath layers of myth. Marcus realized that their quest was only beginning anew. The containment was a temporary reprieve, a pause in the ongoing nightmare. He understood that to truly end the listener's reign, he would have to face the darkest corners of history and human nature, confronting not just an ancient evil but the fears that gave it life. The nightmare was far from over. It had evolved, and so must they. The search for the ancient mirror became an obsession. Every lead, no matter how obscure, was pursued with relentless determination. Libraries hidden deep within forgotten monasteries, dusty archives in remote villages, even whispered legends passed down through isolated communities, all became pieces of a sprawling puzzle that Marcus and his team desperately tried to solve. Fragments of old stories began to form a vague map, a trail that hinted at a location buried beneath centuries of secrecy and decay. The mirror was said to have originated in a small, now abandoned village nestled in the mountains, a place where reality itself had once warped and twisted, leaving behind echoes of horror and madness. The village had been destroyed long ago, wiped off maps after a series of inexplicable disappearances and deaths. Survivors spoke of a terrible curse, a darkness that devoured the souls of those who looked into the mirror's surface. Traveling to that forsaken place was not without risk. The area was known for harsh winters, treacherous cliffs, and a lingering sense of dread that unsettled even the hardiest explorers. Yet Marcus knew that without confronting the mirror itself, the cycle of terror would never end. Upon arrival, the village was little more than ruins swallowed by the wilderness. Broken rooftops jutted from the snow, and the skeletal remains of houses stood like tombstones. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind whistling through shattered windows. The locals from nearby settlements refused to speak of the place, crossing themselves and warning of restless spirits and unspeakable horrors. But Marcus and his team pressed on, following the clues left in the forgotten diaries and folklore. They uncovered a hidden cellar beneath what had once been the village's chapel. The air was thick with decay and something far darker, an almost tangible weight that pressed down on their chests. It was here that the mirror was said to have been kept, its reflection capturing the souls of the damned. The chamber was lined with cracked tiles and faded religious iconography, its walls stained by time and suffering. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it, a large, ornate mirror framed in tarnished silver, its glass cracked but still unervingly clear. The mirror seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural glow, as if alive and aware. Looking into it was like staring into an abyss, where faces flickered and shifted just beyond comprehension. Some saw lost loved ones, others glimpsed their deepest fears reflected back. As Marcus reached out to touch the mirror, a cold rush swept through the room. The air thickened, and whispers filled the space, echoes of voices long silenced, speaking in tongues that scraped at the edges of sanity. The mirror was no mere object, it was a gateway, a conduit for the listener's power. Destroying it would not only shatter the prison but risk unleashing the full force of the nightmare back into the world. The team debated their options, knowing that hesitation could mean doom. They had to find a way to break the curse without awakening the darkness lurking beneath. Ancient texts hinted at a ritual requiring sacrifice, not just of material things but of the spirit. It spoke of forgiveness, release, and the need to confront one's own guilt and fear as part of the process. Marcus understood that this was not simply a battle against an external evil but an internal reckoning. The nightmare fed on pain, regret, and unresolved trauma. Each member of the team was forced to confront their own demons as they prepared for the ritual. Memories long buried surfaced, threatening to unravel their resolve. For Marcus, it meant facing the painful truth of his sister's disappearance, the guilt that he had not done enough, the weight of unanswered questions that had haunted him for years. The night of the ritual was tense, charged with a mix of hope and dread. Candles flickered, casting trembling shadows on the walls as they formed a circle around the mirror. Chanting began, the ancient words rolling off their tongues in a cadence that echoed through the chamber. The air shimmered with energy, and the mirror's glow intensified, revealing scenes from the past, moments of sorrow, betrayal, and violence intertwined with the present. The listener stirred, its presence felt in every shadow and breath. It lashed out with fury, trying to disrupt the ritual, to feed on the fear it provoked. But the team held firm, drawing strength from each other and the knowledge that this was their last chance to end the nightmare. As the ritual reached its climax, Marcus stepped forward, offering not just words but a surrender of his own pain. He spoke aloud, naming his guilt and grief, seeking forgiveness and release. The mirror trembled, cracks spiderwebbing across its surface. Light burst forth, blinding and pure, engulfing the chamber in a wave of cleansing energy. When the light faded, the mirror lay shattered, fragments scattered like shards of forgotten nightmares. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a profound silence. The listener was gone. The nightmare had finally ended. But as Marcus looked at the broken glass, he knew that some shadows never fully disappear, they only hide, waiting for the next reflection to come looking. The shattering of the mirror marked the end of the ritual, but it was far from the end of their journey. As the last shard settled into the dust, a heavy silence filled the chamber, a silence that was both relief and warning. The oppressive darkness that had clung so tightly began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile stillness that felt almost alien after so long. Marcus stood amidst the ruins of the cursed artifact, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders but also sensing a void left behind, as if something essential had been torn away. The listener, the parasitic nightmare that had haunted so many lives, had been banished, yet the echoes of its existence lingered like a ghost in the back of his mind. For weeks after, the world seemed to breathe a collective sigh. Disappearances stopped. The eerie energy that had gripped the containment site faded. The prism, now powerless, was reduced to an inert relic, its glow extinguished forever. But the scars remained, on the land, on the people, and on Marcus himself. Sleep came easier, but dreams were restless. Faces of the lost whispered in the dark, reminders of the pain and sacrifice that had paved the way for this fragile piece. The nightmare was over, but the memories would never fade. Communities that had suffered in the listener's shadow slowly began to rebuild, reclaiming their lives from fear. Families reunited, though the empty chairs at their tables spoke volumes of those who would never return. The truth about what had happened was buried beneath layers of secrecy, too terrifying, too unbelievable to share openly. Marcus returned to his life, but he was forever changed. The burden of knowledge, the weight of loss, and the confrontation with darkness had carved deep grooves in his soul. The sister he had lost was gone, but her memory was now a beacon guiding him toward a future shaped by courage rather than fear. He dedicated himself to helping others who had faced horrors beyond explanation, those who had stared into their own shadows and survived. His work became a quiet mission to protect, to warn, and to prepare. But the question lingered, could such darkness ever truly be destroyed? Or was it an endless cycle, reborn in new forms, waiting for the moment to rise again? Marcus believed that vigilance was the only answer. The nightmare might sleep, but it was never dead. The shattered mirror's fragments were collected carefully and sealed deep beneath layers of concrete and steel in a vault guarded around the clock. The prism was dismantled, its components studied and dispersed to prevent any single point of failure. Still, rumors whispered among the curious and the brave. Some claimed to hear faint voices carried on the wind in the abandoned village, shadows shifting where none should be. Others spoke of fleeting glimpses of a figure watching from the edge of vision, always gone when looked at directly. The listener's legacy had become a modern myth, a cautionary tale passed in hushed tones, a nightmare captured in stories that blurred the line between fact and fiction. For Marcus, these whispers were not just stories, they were reminders. The fight against darkness was ongoing and personal. Every shadow could hide a threat, every reflection might be a doorway. He trained himself to see beyond the obvious, to listen beyond the silence. Because in the spaces between light and dark, that is where true horror waits. And one day, it might return. Until then, Marcus kept watch, his eyes scanning every mirror, every shadow, every whispered voice. The nightmare had been defeated but never forgotten. In the end, the true battle was not against the entity itself, but against the fear that allowed it to grow. It was a fight for the soul of humanity. And Marcus was determined to win. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the unknown. If you felt the darkness tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that will keep you up at night. From all of us here at MrDarXnights, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some nightmares never truly end. Until next time, sleep tight.